Great inventions can change the world and become essential parts of the way we live our lives. Not every invention is a success, though. Sometimes they just don't work out as planned. In other cases, the world just wasn't ready for them yet. When unusual vehicles or technological developments turn out not to be required, they become abandoned and turn into strange, forgotten curiosities. This video is packed full of weird and wonderful creations. You may occasionally hear maglev trains being proposed as transport solutions for modern cities. What many people don't realize is that the Soviet Union made them a reality as long ago as the 1980s. The Wagon TA-05 project was a magnetically cushioned train that hovered above the rails, moving silently at speeds of up to 155 miles per hour. A working model entered operation in 1986 and may have gone on to be a great success, but we'll never know. Fate intervened in the shape of an earthquake in Armenia in 1988, preventing planned development work. When the earthquake was cleared up, the Soviet Union was in the process of collapsing, and there was no more money to finish the project. This is an idea that may one day be revisited. Modern military tanks mostly look the same, but back in 1915, when such vehicles were new, there were differing ideas about the best way to design them. One which didn't make the grade was the Russian Tsar tank, which looks like a cross between an armored vehicle and an old-fashioned penny-farthing bicycle. It's a huge and impressive sight, with two huge front wheels measuring 30 feet in diameter. Unfortunately, the huge wheels turned out to be the Tsar tank's downfall. They had a habit of getting stuck in the mud when they were tested in off-road conditions. That would make them useless on a battlefield, and so the tank was written off at the prototype stage. The inventors were so embarrassed by the failure that they didn't even take it home with them, leaving it in a field near Moscow until 1923, when it was taken apart for scrap. Half boat, half car, the roller ship looks like it belongs in a steampunk movie. Many such ship designs were proposed during the 19th century, but only one was ever built, the Ernest Bazin, named after its creator. The idea behind the ship was a simple one. A series of wheels raised the hull of the ship above the water, reducing friction and maximizing speed. Bazin was so confident that the ship was going to be a success that he claimed it would be the future of transatlantic travel. He neglected to factor in one vital factor, though: the resistance of the water against the huge 33-foot wheels. The water acted as a brake, slowing the ship down instead of speeding it up. More coal had to be added to the engine to push the wheels forward against the water, and that made the roller ship less fuel efficient than the conventional liner. Bazin was still working on a way around the problem when he passed away in 1897, and the idea for roller ships died with him. Here's another take on the idea of a magnetic levitating train. This is a French version of the idea, which came more than a decade before the Wagon project in Russia. Jean Bertin's aero train didn't float on magnets, though. It floated on an air cushion. The aero train service was expected to be cheaper and easier to run than a magnetic train in the long run, but special tracks had to be built to test them, and the construction of the first two prototype trains was costly. There were signs of promise, as trials were conducted between 1965 and 1977, in which speeds of up to 250 miles per hour were achieved consistently. Sadly, the French government stopped funding the tests and decided to invest its new high-speed TGV train network instead. The test tracks are still there today, standing between Rouen and Saran. Soviet scientists were productive and inventive throughout the 1970s and 80s. The Lune-class Ekranoplan is another example of their ingenuity. This unique take on the idea of a seaplane was proposed in 1975, with the only model ever built serving the Soviet and subsequently Russian navies between 1987 and the late 1990s. To the untrained eye, the Lune looks like a regular plane, but it isn't. It used its huge wings to generate ground effect, enabling it to fly as close to the water as 13 feet above it, making it technologically different from not only regular planes but hovercraft, seaplanes, and hydrofoils. 8 turbofans powered the Ekranoplan, propelling it forward at speeds of more than 300 miles per hour. Now retired, the Loon is at a naval station near Kaspiysk. It's not clear why a replacement has never been built. Everybody knows about Americans' space shuttle program, but there was very nearly a workable Russian answer in the shape of the Buran-class orbiter. Visually similar to a space shuttle, it went into space only once, launching in November 1988 and spending 3 hours in orbit before returning to its launch pad and landing as planned on a runway. At the time, it was the first space vehicle to fly in space and land automatically, putting it ahead of American technology. It was a perfect test, but it never flew towards the stars again. The dissolution of the Soviet Union meant that there was no money to carry on, and the spaceship ended up consigned to a hangar in Kazakhstan. To make matters worse, a freak storm caused the roof of the hangar to collapse in 2002, destroying the Buran orbiter in the process. If you've ever been to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, USA, you may have met the two NASA crawler transporters nicknamed Hans and Franz. The two have been working there for some time, moving spacecraft like the Saturn V rocket into position to be launched into space. In fact, they've racked up 50 years of service, and they're still going strong. How is it that we can call them abandoned technology then? Because nobody knows how to replace them. After the Apollo program ended in 1975, the two transporters were mothballed, and the engineers who worked on them moved on. When NASA eventually decided they'd launch more shuttles and rockets, Hans and Franz were brought out of retirement because nobody could work out how to build a new transporter. The technology behind them has somehow been lost. That's why they keep being refurbished and renovated. They simply can't be replaced. Staying with the theme of space, the Buran orbiter had a predecessor in the shape of the MiG-105, also known as the Bast shoe, because of the distinctive shape of its nose cone. This was the first Soviet attempt to create a space plane capable of entering orbit, entering development under the codename of Epos in 1965. It took 11 years to get a prototype built and tested, but the first trial was deemed a success in 1976. Further tests continued over the next 2 years, but the Soviet government was losing enthusiasm for the project. Their heads had been turned by the larger and more attractive Buran program, and so they eventually made the decision to cancel Epos and go with the Buran instead. Unlike the Buran orbiter, the prototype MiG-105 still exists and is on display to the public at the Russian Monino Air Force Museum. Who needs runways when you have a plane that can take off and land vertically? That was the thinking behind the American Lockheed XFV and the Convair XFY Pogo experimental aircraft programs, two simultaneous attempts to create a plane capable of vertical takeoff and landing. The idea was that one of the options would prove to be better than the other, and the winner would be adopted into wide military usage. Unfortunately, neither project could be called a winner. The Lockheed was slow compared to other fighter planes when it took to the air for the first time in 1954, and only highly advanced pilots could fly it, making it unsuitable for general military use. The project was canceled in 1955. The Convair Pogo didn't have any better luck. It was also too slow, and a design flaw meant the pilot had to look backward over their shoulder in order to land the plane. Both prototype planes are now museum exhibits. Ever looked at a tank and thought, that's cool, but it would be cooler if it could fly? If so, you'd have loved the Antonov A-40 flying tank. Other nations flew tanks to battlefields by loading them onto gliders and other planes, but the Soviets decided to try cutting out the middleman and putting the wings on the tank instead. The A-40 was a glider built around the existing T-60 light tank model. A cradle was built around the tank containing wood and fabric wings and a tail, allowing for the tank to land where it was needed, collapse its wings, and be combat ready instantly. All it needed was a larger plane to tow it, and it could do the rest. All of this sounded fantastic in principle, but the planes of the time just weren't strong enough to tow a flying tank. During the one test flight that was attempted, the TB-3 plane towing the A-40 had to ditch the tank to avoid being pulled down by it and crashing. No solution to the weight issue could be found. and the project was abandoned. The Benny railplane was a dynamic and unconventional idea, which probably came years before its time. The mode of transport proposed by eccentric British inventor George Benny involved a plane-like device with a propeller traveling above conventional railways, suspended by a second overhead rail. The idea was that the existing rails on the tracks of England would be used to transport heavy goods, and the new Benny railplane would ride above them, moving faster to transport people and mail. Benny got as far as building a short prototype track near Glasgow in 1930. People were impressed, and tentative orders were placed for 2 short lines between Glasgow and Edinburgh and Blackpool and Southport. But Benny couldn't find the financial support needed to fulfill the orders. He eventually went bankrupt in the attempt to make his dream a reality, and the prototype was sold for scrap. The Americans may have tried and failed to come up with a plane that could perform vertical takeoff and landing in the 1950s, but that didn't stop the Soviet Union from trying for themselves in the 1970s. This time with an attempt to create a plane that could take off from and land on water. The VVA-14 was envisaged not only as a high-altitude flying machine, but also one capable of skimming over the water using ground effect, and stopping on water if required to do so. The basic flight test in 1972 was a success, but fitting inflatable pontoons to help it land on water in 1974 proved to be problematic. Rigid pontoons were tried instead, but further issues with the engine's battery, coupled with the passing of the project's chief designer, Robert Bartini, saw the VVA-14 experiment grind to a halt in 1975. The one existing model is now on display at Menino's Central Air Force Museum, as a reminder of what could have been. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.